Hello, hello. Hi. Oh, the lights just drop like that. Hi, I'm Kathleen Chaffee, and I am deeply honored to serve as the Charles Ballback Chief Curator here at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. I would like to begin today by sharing our land acknowledgement. The Buffalo AKG Art Museum acknowledges the land our campus resides on as the traditional home of the Seneca, Onondaga, and honor the Native American members of our community who continue to bear the burden of a history of displacement as they live nearby and amongst us. We are grateful to live, work, and learn on this land. Thank you all so much to our members who are here with us tonight. It is wonderful to have you. We really appreciate you being here. I am delighted to have the pleasure of introducing tonight's panel. This is the panel, as you all know, I'm sure, for Steina Playback, an exhibition that we co-organized with the MIT List Visual Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the show opened there last October. Steina is indubitably a legendary figure in the media arts landscape. She is a pathbreaker whose work is emblematic of a vibrant and experimental moment in video art from the 1960s in New York, and then, of course, in the 1970s and 80s here in Buffalo, where she moved with her life partner, Woody Vasulka, in 1974. We are incredibly proud to present this exhibition and to help further give her work the attention that it truly deserves. This show came about as a collaboration between the Buffalo AKG's Curator-at-Large, Helga Christoffersen, and MIT List Center's curator, Natalie, with Natalie taking the lead and really developing the vision for this incredible show. Steina was born in Iceland in 1940, and she currently lives and works in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the AKG, therefore, the exhibition is also part of our Nordic Art and Culture Initiative, a platform focusing specifically on art from the Nordic region. It is hard to overstate how important Steina is for our own context here in Buffalo. After arriving in the city, she and Woody were instrumental in the media arts program at UB, where they both taught, today's media study department. There, she influenced generations of artists, thinkers, and students, among them Chris Hill, who we are so fortunate will join us here tonight on stage. At the AKG, we are particularly proud, as one would be, to revisit our own history, given that in 1978, we presented a joint exhibition with Steina and Woody Vasulka here at the museum. Her canonical installation, All Vision, which you're seeing in some of the slides, and I'm sure many of you saw in the show, I hope, it was shown back then, and it's returned to us once again for this exhibition. I think we should all feel a sense of kind of hometown pride as we recognize tonight the way that Buffalo is always making room for the offbeat and the visionary. We, I believe, are so lucky to live in such a city. I want to thank our partner in the exhibition, the MIT List Center. It has been a true honor to work with them. We're grateful for everything they put in to make this exhibition come about. I want to mention the catalog, and my colleague Anise, who just ran and got this for me because I forgot it, this beautiful book that is hot off the presses from MIT Press. And this was edited by Natalie Bell. It is an outstanding resource, not just on Steina, but on the entire media arts environment. I also want to thank curatorial assistant Zach Jin at the List for their incredible work on the show, and section texts in the catalog. And finally, I must thank, even though he couldn't make it tonight, Paul Ha, who is the director of the List Center and was just a remarkable partner on this project. Many others have helped make the show happen. I want to highlight our Icelandic partners, the Reykjavik Art Museum and the Vasulka Chamber, which is part of the Vasulka Archive, for their assistance in the research phase on this project. I want to recognize Berg Contemporary in Reykjavik and Ingebjörg Jonsdottir, Steina's longtime gallery representation. And finally, curator Kirsten Scheving, Steina's close friend and collaborator, who has really provided invaluable insights, I should say, along the way. I'm happy to report that this exhibition will actually be traveling to Iceland in October of this year, where it's going to be split between two institutions. So you'll really be able to take in, all of you who will go to Reykjavik, will be able to take in the city of Reykjavik in between the two locations. So it's going to be on view at the National Gallery of Iceland and the Reykjavik Art Museum. We are so grateful that colleagues from both of those institutions have come to be with us here tonight. I have been asked by my colleagues in the advancement department to mention our museum has a robust travel program, if you didn't know, and supporters of the museum can join us on trips around the world. This June, we are taking a trip with our director, Janne Søren, to Steina's homeland in Iceland. I will be there, Helga will be there, I am sure Steina will be there with us in spirit if we can't convince her to come in the summertime. There remain spots for 2 couples on this trip, so if you are interested, grab me or Jillian Jones if you would like to know more. And finally, I am so happy to acknowledge the whole team here at the AKG, who once more have made an incredible effort in installing a show that sometimes feels like a magic trick has come together. So much research and so many years of preparation go into making exhibitions such as this one, and they all come together in something that almost feels effortless. It almost feels effortless because our team is incredible. I want to thank Denise Mahoney and our registrars, Patrick Robideau and our art prep team, Jamie Robideau and our facilities team, Matt Connolly and everyone in publications, and Amina Boyd in learning and creativity. I also want to recognize a non-staff member, but someone who often feels like he's part of our staff, Kevin Bonner from Advantage TI, who oversaw all of the media installations for this project. And finally, a special thanks to our exhibition coordinator, Maya Martinez, for keeping all of us on track. Okay, and now to tonight's panel. I am delighted to introduce our 3 panelists. They will speak for about 30 minutes, and then they're going to leave time for your questions, which we really look forward to hearing. I know so many of you know this work better than we do and are dedicated to this artist and the context that she helped build here in Buffalo. So we look forward to hearing this. No pressure, but we look forward to hearing your questions. So our 3 speakers tonight. Chris Hill is a media curator, currently on the faculty of Cal Arts. Hill received an MFA from SUNY Buffalo and was a video programmer at Hall Walls here in Buffalo for over a decade. She curated the rather legendary Surveying the First Decade, Video Art and Alternative Media in 1996 for Video Data Bank. Good luck finding copies of those tapes. If you do, they are invaluable. She interviewed artists active in the Czech parallel culture before 1989 in Walking Trips in Czech Lands from 1997. Her research interests include reperforming archives and beekeeping practice. Her recent project for the Veselka Kitchen Archive is a navigational tool for traversing the Veselka mediascape. And there's a version of that project, you have the ability to access that project in the exhibition. I hope you'll take the chance to look at it. Natalie Bell is curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, where she has organized recent solo exhibitions of Basil Abbas and Ruan Abu Ram, Matthew Angelo Harrison, Leslie Thornton, Sung Chu, and Rit Premnath, and she co-curated the group exhibition Symbionts, Contemporary Art and the Biosphere. From 2013 to 2019, she was associate curator at the New Museum, where she curated and co-curated over a dozen solo exhibitions and several major group exhibitions. Helga Christoffersen is Curator-at-Large and curator of the Nordic Art and Culture Initiative here at the Buffalo AKG, where she recently curated the exhibition Lapselam, Dreamer's Cay, and After the Sun. She is also the co-curator of Northern Lights, an exhibition that just opened at the Byler Foundation in Basel, Switzerland, and it will come here this August, an absolutely amazing show of kind of early modern landscapes from the Nordic region and from Canada. From 2019 to 2020, she was the executive director of Art Hub Copenhagen, and from 2013 to 2019, she was associate curator at the New Museum in New York. Thank you all for listening to my long remarks and my introductions, and I'd like to invite you to join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Chris and Natalie, for being here. I'm really honored to have you here with us, honored to be in conversation with you. Looking forward to these 30 minutes. Also knowing that there are so many here in the room that really knew Steina, knows this work well, I hope we can sort of do justice getting around some of the really key questions, interests that led to this exhibition, and then with the hope that you will join us towards the end with questions and comments, and surely your sort of wealth of knowledge on this massive legacy. I'm going to sort of kick us open with a few questions and then see if we can get down a road of conversation. I think, Natalie, if I could ask you first to maybe sort of introduce Steina, because I think as much as many of you maybe know her, I think it's also due to really place her and say who's Steina.
Thank you. Thanks, Helga. That's a big question, and I'll try to be concise, but as you all have probably gleaned, if you've seen the exhibition before this conversation, Steina is a video and media art pioneer who was born in Iceland and moved to the United States in the 1960s. She really fell into the New York scene of the late 60s, living downtown, working in a loft space, and what's important about her early years is that she was a musician. She trained as a violinist and was practicing as a musician in New York City, freelancing, excuse me, and then discovered video, and in her words, fell in love with video. And it became this kind of all-consuming passion for her, completely took the place of music in a sense, not completely, but almost completely, and became this way for her to experiment with a brand new medium. And we'll get into that a little bit, but just to say that when we're talking about video, and sorry because some of you know this very well and some of you maybe don't, but we're talking about videotape, cassette tapes, and this important distinction that happened moving from film to video and what was possible with that medium. So rather than using celluloid, things were on tape, and it had a lot of overlap with music and music being used on tape at that time, and it opened up a lot of possibilities for electronic processing. So that's kind of the core of what was formative for Steina, and we can talk more about how that evolved over the course of her career.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm curious to hear from you, Chris, sort of as another way of, let's say, introducing Steina. I guess I wanted to ask you, like, who is Steina also in her time? I mean, in that moment where her and Woody arrived in New York City, became part of a scene there, became part of an interest, became part of a group of people who really were pushing and exploring a medium. And I guess if you could sort of place her in that context and say...
So Steina and Woody had gone to film school in Prague, and Steina was a musician. So together they discovered video, which was a brand new medium in the late 60s. And they were, at that time, artists were paying a lot of attention to the materials of the medium that they were working in. So filmmakers, well, especially, one more thing to say about that is that they were not interested in narrative at all, and not so interested in documentary, even though they both worked at places where they helped documentarians who were working with video at the time. But they were very interested in the medium. They were interested in that both sound and image were made by waveforms and frequencies. So the electronic sound and electronic image were produced by the same elements, by the same materials. And for example, you'll see in Steina's Violin Power, which is in the gallery, which is a series of kind of experiments that happen over a decade. You can see her actually feeding the audio signal into the video image, so you can see it distort the video image. They were part of a scene in New York where Steina referred to the different interests in video as tribes. A number of times, some people were more interested in documentaries, some people were interested in video as a kind of performative medium because especially in the late 60s, people weren't doing much editing. Editing was actually done with a razor blade at the very beginning. So they were part of a group of people that were really interested in the signal, and people were sharing information. They both talk a lot about how generous everybody was. People would always be sending you someplace else, to find out about something. A lot of people got together on a regular basis at an electronics store on Canal Street, C.T. Louis, who actually helped install the West when it was in, I don't know if he helped install here or not, but he was actually in Boston. So everybody talks about how important it was to share information. And so they were part of that scene, and they would go out initially. They were also just excited to be in New York. It was such a different place than Prague was, and Iceland too, I guess. And they started documenting a lot of performances, underground performances. Woody was particularly interested in jazz, rock and roll, and they would take the tape back to their loft at night, and people would come to their home and watch the replay of what had happened during the day. Now, that doesn't seem like such a big deal now, but at the time it was revelatory, and it was something that could not happen with film. Film had to be developed. So there was this excitement over the immediacy of video, and they hosted all these people that would come back to their loft, which is one of the reasons that they eventually were very happy to found the kitchen, because some of those people could explore ideas and play at the kitchen instead of staying all night at their house. So they were part of that scene, and they both describe how absolutely exciting it was. It was a new field, and there weren't even really critics much writing about it. So it was there to explore. And one other thing that was very important at the time was the New York State Council on the Arts decided to fund media and to fund media arts centers, artist-run centers throughout the state. And this is, of course, well before, this is analog video, right? Well before digital video, well before the internet. So people had to talk to each other, people had to go visit each other. And so all these different spaces in New York State played a very major role in developing ideas about the medium. And actually, there's some people here who were part of the Experimental Television Center in Owego, who maybe we can talk later. The Vasilka spent a lot of time there with like-minded people. So a lot of their tribe hung out at the Experimental Television Center, I would say.
I would add, too, that I think an important thing to know about Steina and Woody is that they didn't care about being artists. They were never out to try and get museum shows. They weren't interested in selling their work. They were really outsiders in an admirable sense. And they were also culturally outsiders. They, were both coming from, Woody was coming from communist Czechoslovakia, Steina from Iceland. Woody, because of his upbringing there, had absolutely no interest in narrative film or video. So when they discovered that what they could do with video was really tried to investigate its materiality and its structure, that was fascinating to them. They had, there were many artists who picked up video cameras in 1969, 1970, and so on, and they wanted to take them to the streets, and they wanted to use this immediacy of playback to do radical things, or they were using video to film their own performances or to respond to broadcast television's tropes. And the Vasilkas were not at all interested in that. They didn't come up with American television culture. They didn't care about it. They didn't own a TV that they would watch TV on. They were really just interested in the medium, its specificity, what it could do, and how they could distort it and make art from it. And as you mentioned, Chris, a lot of it, especially in their early years, was a matter of cross-feeding audio and video signals. That was a novelty. That was incredibly exciting to them. And it was also opening up these new modes of perception, which was another thing that was, very much in the in the zeitgeist of that moment of people thinking about binocularity, thinking about waveforms, trying to understand the science of perception at the same time that they were doing tons of drugs.
Yeah, and I think maybe something we could unpack a little further is sort of the technical side of what Steina and Woody did in those sort of early days, because I think part of what, at least for me, has come to this project and this legacy is also, understanding how they worked, not just that they worked with videotapes, but they are in a way engineers. I mean, they are builders, they are inventors of machines, and I wonder if we can sort of try to just a little bit more unpack, like what's their artistic process, what's the process? Because I have a sense that, I mean, even in the show we have this very big, large image in the first gallery from Steina's studio here in Buffalo, and that was really also intended to give you a sense of like Steina in this sea of machines and wires, and I don't know whether Chris, you can speak to that, or Natalie, like you, or we can sort of try and get a little closer without getting too technical in how they were making work those early days, which is also like a lot of the collaborative work.
I'll say I find really interesting how their tools really situate them as post-war artists, and we use that term a lot, but I really mean post-war in the sense that Woody grew up. He was a child at the end of World War II. He was picking out of piles of military refuse and scrapyards in Eastern Europe and learning how to build things and melt down metals and make things from military scraps. And then came into filmmaking, but was also fixing up motorcycles. That's how they met. When Steina asked Woody to fix her motorcycle when she was studying at the conservatory in Prague. So I think, and then you also fast forward to their time in New York City, they were buying tools on Canal Street from like military surplus stores. So there was still this kind of residue of the war that was circulating as material for artists, and especially for material for artists who were tinkering with media. And yeah, I would say, they were makers, they were builders, they were tinkerers. Steina was a little bit reluctant to do a lot of the engineering herself, but Woody kind of prompted her, and at a certain point was like, hey, I'm busy making my own things. You do it yourself. I'll show you how. And then, of course, they worked with tons of engineers and effectively commissioned tools from people who were better at making them than they were and knew more, but the Vasulkas would come to them and say, hey, you did this thing with that colorizer, can you do that, but like in this way for this new thing? And, and then these guys would get to work on it and deliver them, a mystery box that, we see these things today. There's one slide of several of them. You have no idea, it's just, some knobs and dials. But these were the tools that they were using to cross-feed, to distort, to manipulate the sound and to manipulate the signal, basically, is what it boiled down to.
Yeah, they often talked, well, in fact, many of the works in the gallery that were done in the 70s are demos. They were experiments. They were, you could call, some of Steina's work, she refers to it as machine vision, where she even has the cameras on a turntable, so that she was divorcing the camera from human vision. And I think it's important, and you even see in Orbital Obsessions a couple of different setups where Steina and Woody are in the room, and you can see them kind of looking at it, and she's smiling, like trying to see whether he finds what's interesting, some of the things that she's found interesting in the setup that she did. They talk about dialogues with tools, that the tools were their teachers. Steina said in an interview that, she would set something up thinking that what was going to happen might be interesting, and then the tools kind of showed her that really there was something even different and more interesting, you know. So they credited the tool makers in their work. I mean, they, even as late into the 80s, the credits at the end of Art of Memory include all the people who were the tool designers that made instruments that Woody incorporated into that piece. So they, again, their tribe of people were also very interested in tools. And in fact, one of the other things that the Voslokas are really should be acknowledged for is how they were very interested in passing on this information and preserving this information. They started archiving not only their own work, but like people would send them tapes saying, I did this, I hooked up this to this, and so they have all these how-to tapes that were sent to them by their friends. And in the 90s, they did a massive exhibition at Ars Electronica in Austria, where they got these tools together, they got them working again, they got the specs, they published the specs, and then you could actually see the tapes that were made with some of these tools. This is like kind of an incredible archiving effort for the next generation, if you will. This is the kind of stuff that they really believed in, and again, it kind of goes back to perhaps, or at least, you know, I've heard Woody say this, and also another friend says this in an interview. It went back to Woody's having grown up across the road from an airfield that had been bombed in the Second World War, and how he and his buddies, you know, 8- and 9-year-old boys were going through these airplanes and finding chocolate bars and guns and all the stuff that was left. So this is, you know, and then they came to the United States and thought that Americans did not respect their history. So they felt that if what they were exploring and spending, being so excited about learning, it really needed to be archived and put in forms that would be available for the next generation. Or, as any of you who work in media know, media is changing so rapidly that it's sometimes very difficult to go back in time and actually try to understand the aesthetics that were associated with a particular moment in time, like this analog video from the 70s. But they help you out, and sometimes they do voiceovers on the tapes, so that, you know, they're actually telling you what they're doing. They want you to understand what they're doing.
I'm just going to follow that up with a quick comment, which is, Chris, you mentioned earlier the place of demos in their work and their interest in education. It is worth underscoring, because it's, I think, one of the reasons that Steina's work and Woody's work and some of their joint work didn't find a home in art museums, or, you know, outside of film festivals or video festivals even, because a lot of it looked like demos. It looked like educational videos, and they were often making it for public television. And, you know, at another time there was actually funding that they were receiving to do that. But it's remarkable because they were doing it with this ethos of just creating content to share with others because it was cool and interesting, and they wanted other people to be able to do that too. And they weren't trying to do it to make an artwork or to make a masterpiece or to make something that a museum would buy or go to collectors. And it's so funny to look, it's not funny, it's really interesting to look back at that now, and look back at that from the position of a museum curator as well, because there are works in the show that early on I wasn't even considering putting in the show, because they don't look like artworks, they look like demos and public television bits. And then, you know, but once I understood the importance of this, I understood, no, this is their work. This is what is important about it, and this was their ethos. It would be a mistake to not include this.
But I think also what you're both touching on is this really strong core in the work of really advancing something, exploring it, showing it, sharing it, making other people do it, then building something new that builds on that, and yeah, which is also really, really sort of an educational mission, I think, which is also reflected in their time here in Buffalo and what happens when they relocate to Buffalo in '74 from New York City, and become hugely influential in our own context here, also because they became really dedicated more of their time to teaching. I don't know, maybe particularly you, Chris, if you can sort of speak a little bit to what they mean in the Buffalo context and what happened after they arrived here.
Well, there's the Buffalo context, and then there's also the New York State context. And Buffalo in the 70s, as the second largest city in New York State, got pretty decent arts funding. So you had a number of artist-run spaces in Buffalo. Hallwalls and SEPA are still around. Also, there was Media Study Buffalo, which was an artist-run space with the same name as the department at the university. So there were also artists at UB. So, and then in addition to that, you had the music department at UB. Many of you probably are familiar with the kind of very exciting experimental work that was done across media in Buffalo in the 70s, and continued after the 70s too, but the 70s is also like a period of time where there was some halfway decent funding for this kind of work. And so the Vasulkas were, I mean, actually the public television, WNED, did a 6-part series with them in 1978, which was the same year as the exhibition at the Albright Knox. So they were very active in Buffalo, and at the same time they were also very active throughout the state, connecting with various people that were interested in the signal, interested in the same kind of sort of theoretical investigations that they were involved with. You know, you might think about their, again, orbital obsessions is the work that's in the gallery that seems to show the kind of, their studio as a kind of landscape that they were working with. And then when they moved to the Southwest, of course, then the Southwest, the outdoors, became a different landscape for Steina. And you see that very much so in her, in the more recent work, the work of the last couple decades.
And I wonder, I don't know, maybe Chris, you can speak to how they as a couple and each of them individually influence like a student body here. If there is, you know, maybe there's even students here in the space.
Well,
certainly you are.
There are people in the audience who are their students, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe that would be interested in saying something when.
I don't know, because earlier when we were preparing for this talk, you were talking about the importance of them really, I don't know, focusing on a platforming like sort of analog video aesthetics and making that sort of a priority, or building a community around that investment, specifically here in Buffalo, and passing that on.
I mean, I think that, so I came to Buffalo in the early 80s, and so while I wasn't here in the 70s, I caught them, I was their student in the last semester that they were teaching at UB. But what the legacy of the media arts, the explorations that came out of UB was spectacular for me as somebody who was just sort of, you know, thought maybe I wanted to make documentaries, and then, you know, sat through Steina and Woody's class and sort of at a certain point said, oh my God, this is like conceptually and perceptually so interesting. So it was like learning something that I don't know that I could have gotten that education many other places at that time. But you had a number of people that were working in different ways with media in the city. You had spaces that were very interested in letting people experiment. Hallwalls was one of them, SEPA was one of them, Media Study Buffalo, definitely. You had a lot of visiting artists coming in, supported by New York State Council on the Arts mainly. I think that, you know, you have some students, for example, Arnold Dryblot was one of their early students who started out being very interested in video, thinking about waveforms and frequencies, and then became composer and musician. He's actually going to perform at Hallwalls in May. So you have students that sort of were totally inspired by working with the materials and took these ideas in different directions. Yeah.
And then maybe if we can sort of jump a little bit to their move when they left Buffalo, because I think that's you sort of started talking about that, Chris, in what happened when the camera also was sort of oriented elsewhere, like from being developed in the studio and really sort of featuring the studio setting and that being the prominent imagery in the work. Then of course for Steina particularly something really big happens when Steina and Woody leave Buffalo and settle in Santa Fe. I wonder if we can sort of unpack that a little bit. Also, maybe Natalie, starting with you as well, because I think that's something that we talked about also early on in thinking about this exhibition, is in a way where Steina ended up in her much more large-scale work that was really, that became also very environmental, and both what that work is, what it meant in its time, and also how we're thinking about that work today.
Well, it's worth identifying that Steina and Woody's practices diverged around 1975, and that was when they had just arrived in Buffalo. Woody had taken a teaching position. Steina came along. It was like a pretty well-paying position, and it was enough to get them to leave New York City. And it was kind of by coincidence that they took a different direction. Only in the sense that like Woody was out of town one week and Steina was just bored doing something by herself and like stuck the camera on the car and started driving, and then became fascinated by machine vision. And that's when she really took off with her machine vision and all vision projects, and thinking about ways to automate the movement of the camera so that it would be beyond her own subjectivity. And that became a really crucial essence of her work and image making practice. When they moved to Santa Fe, yes, landscape became suddenly very present. And I think early on in the project, we were wondering how to bridge that with her early work, because it does feel really, it feels like a disjunct. And as a curator, you're always trying to find, the narrative through to help bring other people through that. And I wondered if one of the reasons why Steina's later work hadn't been as well known or as well exhibited was because it was such a jump into landscape and really looking closely at nature in this way. And what people had known was the early work before 1975 that was so obsessed with the signal. So how do you get from signal to nature? And I think there's a few ways that you actually do see that bridge. Some of it is in just the flow and movement, and thinking about signals also needing a constant flow. And then there's some just kind of poetic resonances, like the massive satellites that you see in the West when she was visiting the Very Large Array in the Southwest. That's a signal, it's going back to that, and she's thinking about what is being sent out, and who are we sending it out to, by the way. But the very basic fact of, what is her immediate surroundings, that's kind of the first step. And it is just that simple. She was never an artist who went out looking for a subject. She just was working with the tools and experimenting with the tools and playing with the tools wherever she was. And it's really just that simple.
I would say the other thing, if you look at the early work from the 70s, you'll see, I think in Matrix, you have a set of monitors and the images flow across the monitors. And they talk about how they always, for some reason, they really like the idea of having 4 or 5 monitors at a time. They would try to lug these things around New York in cabs. Another reason why they really wanted to have the place like the kitchen, where they could just have, they didn't have to lug these huge monitors around. But they found there was a broken cable And it created this horizontal drift of the image across the monitors, which actually is a kind of a landscape, suggestion of landscape. And I think that if you look at Steina's work, she was very interested in mixing two landscapes through luminance keying or chroma keying. We could talk about those tools, but these are ways of mixing two images that are particular to video, and oftentimes it's landscape, and oftentimes it's drifting. So I think even when she was working with the signal, with analog video, these ideas that sort of then take a different type of form later, but it's still a kind of a landscape. There's still this movement, there's a kind of horizontal movement.
Yeah, and I think landscape was there for Steina from the beginning, just because she was Icelandic, and the landscape there is so striking. And her works from 1980 onward, yes, they're engaging the landscape of the Southwest, but they're also starting to draw in the landscape of Iceland. And you notice with her, the works that are the latest works in this exhibition from around 2000, that she's really returning to the Icelandic landscape again. I think we should open it up for questions.
Yes. Let's do that.
Or comments?
Questions, recollections.
Over there.
Could you talk about the interaction with other artists at the time that they had, such as avant-garde filmmakers? There were a lot of those in Buffalo at the time as well. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was if we could speak to their relationship with other artists at the time, and especially the avant-garde filmmakers in Buffalo.
Well, I'd like to actually call on Per Boda, who was one of the people who worked at the Experimental Television Center, and was just telling me in the gallery about how often the Vasulkas came to the Experimental Television Center, and how exciting it was to see these collaborative efforts. Could you just say something briefly, Per?
Continuation of the conversation half an hour ago, right? I mentioned to Chris how in 1974, which is when Woody and Steina came to Buffalo, was also the time I started as an artist in residence at the Experimental Television Center in Binghamton. And that was a time when Nam June Paik had already been there 20 times and had been making his early installation pieces with Ralph Hocking. And the center was evolving and becoming more and more involved in electronic image processing, and tools were being built. And Woody and Steina were involved with tools being built, as you mentioned. And so part of their interest coming down was this was part of their scene that they were engaged with. And they, I remember early on, they came down and met with Ralph Hocking and Walter Wright and a number of other people. And that had to do with how can we begin to make video with computers. And so there were all kinds of meetings that had happened, and I don't know the specifics of how it went from those meetings to their developing of their systems here in Buffalo, the image articulator that you mentioned, et cetera. There were numerous buffers and technologies being built by young artists and young engineers. And in a sense, we all benefited from a whole history of electronic music tools that had, I'm not off the top of my head right now, 30, 40, 50 years of those being developed. And electronic music centers in the 50s existed around the world, and artists were working with them. And Woody and Steina were aware of that, and they were, in a sense, they were Europeans who came to America who were continuing a tradition that they had experienced of artists being connected with technologies. So Binghamton was one of those hotspots. It also had its university there with filmmakers who were colleagues with the filmmakers here. So Larry Godham and Ken Jacobs, and actually Nicholas Ray and Peter Gubelka in Binghamton, and then that hot spot, and then Buffalo with Hollis and Hollis Frampton and Paul Scherritz and Tony Conrad. There was a lot of movement that happened with the artists across the state, not just between Binghamton and Buffalo, but those were like very significant nodes in this system. And it was a time, there was no internet, there was a time when people talked to each other. And you met up with each other and you had dinner together and you planned and you introduced each other to other people. And that whole kind of, quote, networking friendships was, I think, it was a very big part of what we did. And in fact, even the New York State Council funded some of the engineers to have phone calls, group phone calls, because long distance calls were expensive. So it was a way of supporting engineers to actually talk to each other as to what they were developing, and not with any goal in mind for a particular endpoint, but just staying in touch and sharing what you now learned about. And the other thing I would just say about this, which is, it was very much something Woody and Steina were involved with, which we were involved with as well, was there were, quote, synthesizers, right? There was the Pike Abe synthesizer. Abe was an engineer from Sony who worked with Namjoon, and they put this together, I think first at JBH in Boston, and then a second and third one were built at the TV Center in Binghamton. The idea of synthesizer was in the air. It was a way of talking about what these modular tools were. And the point that I want to get across is these analog synthesizers were, they were very rich and complicated. I mean that in a positive way. And when digital happened, a lot of the concepts that were in those analog tools carried right over to digital. Ralph Hawking and numerous people have said there's too much emphasis on analog and digital. It wasn't that big a divide. In fact, a lot of the ideas that were being developed migrated into a new means. There was electronics were tubes at one point, then they became transistors, then they became integrated circuits. Then those circuits went to the next stage and had a computer, another kind of integrated circuit that was a computer chip, etc. And it's interesting that artists would be involved in these things, right? So that's the other part of it, and that I think also was partly this thing of the engineers being happy to have people who were encouraging them. That was the artists, and what that sort of dialogue was that happened across that. So, and Steina very much was engaged in those conversations, and actually not too long ago, Steina told me I was the person who introduced her to the mirror ball. I said, I did? And it probably would have been around 74. And as I try to put it back, yes, in America we have these lawn ornaments. And I think you can go here in Buffalo to Menny's right on Niagara Falls Boulevard, and you can buy one. And she did. And actually then there was a show, I think at the Birchfield, where she then did it again. We went back to Menny's 20 years later. They still had them, so anyway, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much for that.
I don't know if there's other questions, other comments. Something that it just occurred to me that we forgot to get around, which I think is really important, and maybe just to address quickly, is the idea of play in her work. Maybe not to open it up as a discussion, but say that's something that we have all three talked a lot about, is something that you and I, Natalie, talked a lot about, and sort of her ethos of play, and really insisting on play as a mode of working, and maybe also the reason why her legacy, sort of has fallen under the radar in many sense and not be taken too serious, as opposed to the other artists who were working, let's say, using the media in more political ways, more serious ways, and she was sort of really, insisting on play as her modus operandi, and that's also how radical that is. Anyway, just to sort of add that in.
Yeah, thanks, Helga. I feel like you kind of just said it all, but this did emerge as something that felt really critical to Steina's work. And on one level, it felt like, oh, this comes out of her being a musician. She understands this idea of play as something that you can do just for yourself. You don't need an audience to play the violin and take pleasure in it. And for, I think on some level, and this is maybe our speculation, but she's confirmed it, is that, working with tools and playing creatively in the medium of video really felt similar. And I think play also is, it's antithetical in some ways to experimentation, because you experiment to realize something. There's an end goal. It's a means to an end, and play doesn't have to have an end. And that feels like something distinctive about it, potentially political about it, or radical, whatever you want to say. But it makes it something that it can't be instrumentalized for someone else, and that is also what makes Steina's works feel so sort of firmly independent and sort of free from outside pressure.
Violin Power, which is in the gallery as a single channel tape, which is a series of experiments, and then starting in the 90s, she started playing a MIDI violin. So that's like a digital violin where she programmed the strings to do different things. So one of the strings she used to access her archive, which was on computer, and then another string would maybe introduce playing it backwards, and another string would introduce some other kind of effect that she was interested in applying to that particular piece. And then, so she did this, she's done Violin Power performances up until recently. I don't know when the last one was, but she did a performance at the Birchfield, I think that was in 2011 or 2013. Her as a violinist, she opened up her, like if you see the very beginning of Violin Power, she's playing classical music, and then you see her exploring, what happens when you put the audio signal into the video input, into one of the video inputs, and then later with the MIDI violin, you see other ways of performing with a violin. There's always a lot of randomness in her experiments and in her performance, and so I think she is really interested in playing, and she modified her sacred violin, to be a digital tool, and that she still stands on stage with the bow and plays it, So, I mean, it's interesting to perhaps think about her as a musician and what role play played for her in her experience as a media artist, which involved both sound and image.
I think there's one hand, maybe a very quick question we have the time for before we wrap up.
Going back to the 60s, could you address what the difference in potential was between film and the new medium of video? I mean, and what did it allow that was different from film previously?
Chris, you're better equipped to answer this, but I'll start and then you can fill in my gaps. Basically, film needed to be developed, right? Film needed to be developed, so you couldn't film something and then see it right away. You had to send it out to get it developed, and then you needed projector equipment to see it. You needed some space to project it. Video, you could see it right away because it was recording onto a tape, and then you'd play back from that same tape. So it also was much more portable, so it was easier. It was still quite heavy, I think, early on, but artists were more able to carry it around. It was more affordable, and it had sound recorded on the same tape as the video was recorded onto, whereas filmmakers then had to have a separate sound set up and then sync it with the film. So that was more interesting for documentary workers at the time, but yeah, for the Vasulkas, it was about an interest in the signal and the fact that what they were recording the video onto was the equivalent of what people were recording music onto, and they could just swap them and start distorting them. So the things that they saw electronic musicians doing at that time with synthesizers or all of these other tools, suddenly they were like, oh, whoa, we can do the same thing with images because of this videotape.
I would just add that, both film and video are time-based media, right? So aesthetics also have to do with duration and time. This is also be true of sound, right? But especially in the 60s, you had artists in all mediums. Like you had painters that were interested in the two-dimensionality of the canvas and the paint dripping on the canvas. There's some of that work in the museum. With film, some of the people that were interested in film, people that were not so interested in narrative, might be scratching on the film. They'd scratch on the celluloid. So film as a surface was something you actually could hold in your hands. Anna's nodding her head because she's somebody who works with mushrooms and puts it on celluloid and, lets it be a kind of an organic medium. But the medium of video, the electronic medium of video was frequencies and waveforms and voltages. So it was a different medium. So for example, at Hallwalls, there was a film curator and a video curator in the 70s and 80s, and they were looking, really, the aesthetics were fairly different at that time. I mean, now they're sort of collapsed and you have digital media and some people shoot on film and they edit on video. I mean, these things some of the differences have collapsed, even though there are still, one of the big differences between film and video at the time was that the film emulsion produced a very sensuous image. The video image, initially, it was black and white, it was poor resolution. If you wanted to preserve something, you would never shoot on video because nobody even knew if it could be, how long that tape would hold its magnetic, the filings. I mean, eventually the iron oxide filings did crumble off the tape. So, they're related, but they were different enough that when people could get a hold of a video camera, and it was the 60s, right? So there was, people had ideas about utopia. I mean, the Vasulkas talked about this too. They really thought that this new technology was going to really influence the way people thought. People were really interested in consciousness change. So there was a lot of, philosophizing about that, but there were people that were really interested in going out and shooting in their community. They could reuse the tape. The Vasulkas did this with participation. They shot stuff and invited people back to their loft. I mean, these were things you could never do on film. So that kind of immediacy, it became kind of like a conversation.
I would just add to that there were different ways of playing it back. So, with film, you had to have a projector. With video, you couldn't project it until much later. And I'm just mentioning this because it's important for Steina's work, and it's the reason why we have these big boxy televisions throughout the show, is because that's the medium that video was played back on. At that time, that's how they presented it. And it wasn't until the mid-90s when video projection technology was accessible to artists, meaning it was something they could reasonably afford, that Steina and other artists started using projection and installation in that way because they were committed to video, and video just wasn't wasn't doing that. And that's also one of the reasons why in her earlier works before that, when she's trying to scale up, it's a matter of stacking monitors and creating more scale through this kind of grid or pixelation of them, because it just couldn't have been projected. Okay, we're at time. Sorry to squeeze in that last point.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.